Hello from panel. We have had already very nice presentations, and now it's really pleasure to have a panel session together with all three presenters. And Stephen Olson is now, I hope, in Singapore watching us. So hello, Stephen. And Krister Ljungvall is here, and Lauri Melkso just finished is also here. And we have a bit of time to maybe think about those questions which were raised in all these presentations. Of course, Stephen already raised so many questions that we need many hours to cover all that. But we have to do some selection. And we have also a fourth session about the future of trade and the world order, where we can also cover some questions. But now I start with the very first issue I would like to raise. And in homepage of Hinrich Foundation is very interesting quotation by the founder of foundation, which says following: "Peace is a natural effect of trade, but only when trade is mutually beneficial and sustainable for peace and prosperity." And now my question is that let's discuss a bit. There is one way we are thinking that trade leads to peace and prosperity. And there is another view that trade actually leads to the confrontation, and trade is actually also important to gain power. And now my question is, we can maybe a bit dispute. Can we somehow change this movement now towards confrontation, or we need to adapt? And if we adapt, in which way? Because that's, I think, one very important issue here. And Stephen, if you would like to comment, I think simply you start if you would like to comment. And others are here in audience, we can ask from them. So please.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, once again. I really look forward to the opportunity when I can join you there in person. In terms of the question that was posed, I'd make a couple of points. I'd say, look, I think our starting point has to be a recognition of the reality of where we are today. And the reality that we've seen is that our trading relationships and our economic interdependence, which has really been the lifeblood of globalization in the post-World War II era, we're coming to an increasing recognition that these trade relationships and our interdependence not only bring economic benefits, not only bring prosperity and economic development, they can also be weaponized against us. And they can also bring risks and vulnerabilities. Now, we might like that or we might not like it, but I think we've got to recognize that, at least for the current time, is the reality that we're dealing with. So I think it's inevitable that we're starting to see a certain degree of fragmentation in the global trading system. The US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen talks about a lot about what she likes to refer as friendshoring. I'm not so sure friendshoring is the best word. I think it's really about trust. Countries that you can trust to engage in deep economic integration without the fear that interdependence will someday be turned against you and weaponized against you. So I think this is our first challenge, to accept that for better or for worse, this is our new reality, and figure out what's the best way that we can approach this. But as I say, a degree of fragmentation, I think, is going to be inevitable.
Oh, thank you. But now we can ask also from Krister, for example, what is your view on this question?
Well, I was very happy to note the citation from Heinrich Foundation, which I think relates to Montesquieu in the mid-18th century, actually, who declare that peace is the natural effect of trade. I think Stephen is correct in his analysis that we need to recognize the time of change. The problem is that why did we not recognize this 10 or 15 years ago? Basically saying we're bad analysts. And I think that's because there is a divide between multinationals and their objective functions and the government's objective function when it comes to trade. China have changed, I do not have to say, dramatically in the past 40 years, in the past 20 years, in the past 10 years. And wouldn't it have been for China's rapid development, in particular in technology trade, we still would not have recognized the reality of problems that comes ahead. Fragmentation, yes. Fragmentation is also costly. In Europe and in Sweden in particular, we tend to discuss China as, should we trade with non-democracies or not? The fact is, the way that China has developed, the way that Swedish trade relationships with China has developed, we cannot choose not to trade with China. However, we need to ask ourselves the question, or pose the question, how should we trade with China? How should we trade with non-democracies? Because it's a fact. We cannot rule out that China is a major part of the global GDP and trade flows. I mean, it's there, and it's going to be there for a long time. That's basically my first comment.
And maybe, Lauri, you can add a bit how this international organization could actually somehow fight against this confrontation which we are seeing here, and what are the limits of power of these institutions? You partly already talked about in presentation, but maybe now you can a bit elaborate this point as well.
I think it's going to be difficult because those very states are major stakeholders in these international organizations. We have seen it in the case of the United Nations that basically, you know, things don't work very well without the approval of Security Council permanent members. The General Assembly has to step in instead, but then it's questionable what exactly is the constitutional authority of the General Assembly. And well, trade is more perhaps fragmented in its governance, and investment is even more fragmented in that, in international investment law, than security. I think simply what it helps us to reminder is this insight from studies, from literature. For example, the book by Paul Kennedy is that it is inevitable that economic power in the end will translate into military power. And there is always a temptation to use the benefits of trade for basically calling the shots also in security, and who thought otherwise about the rise of China must have been naive. At some point, this temptation is irresistible to solve also the security questions and dilemmas in one's favor, because one can afford it. One look at the speed with which China is currently building its navy, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but then I ask a completely different question from Christer now, and that is a question how this confrontation between US and China is going on. And I ask from that point of view, how strong is China, and what are the potential, I would say also barriers in growing the power of China? And you are a specialist in China and lived a long time there. What is your view on that?
China's biggest hurdle for continuous growth is a little bit unexpected to you. It's China's higher education system. When it comes to confrontation and can China sustain? I mean, first we should ask ourselves, do we want China to thrive in the future? Yes, of course, because China is and will be an important trading partner. Are there risks to China's growth model? Absolutely. And again, I'm telling you that just combining North America and the EU, coordinating our efforts in trade negotiations with China, we're twice as large. That is real power. The fragmentation, confrontation we will see, that will continue to exist, but we have to live with that. We have to find models where we say yes to collaboration, where we say maybe, and when we say no. But we have to analyze each and every step carefully, avoiding to trade that comes with the cost. We can basically cut off China completely. It will take us 5 years. It will be costly, extremely costly, but we can do it. Do we want to do it? Of course not. So we need to find a way to work with China where we actually can be on an equal or perhaps even stronger basis. That's the only way. There are a lot of things that can go wrong in China. The financial system, et cetera, but let's find a new model of trading that includes China, that does not exclude it. And just one brief comment. The discussion in Europe today is about competition from China. And we are about to solve that through subsidies, through subsidized European countries. That is the wrong way to go. The only way to deal with China or win over Chinese companies is to be even better. We need to produce complements even in the future. Today, we're increasingly producing substitutes.
So what you say us is that we should invest in research and development in higher education in Europe, maybe 5 times more than before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, but now I'll come to Stephen. You have, of course, your view on that question, but I maybe also amend it a bit. You mentioned in your talk also the role of values in trade. And I would also ask in this discussion about the growing role of China and barriers of that, how much we are ready to pay for values. That's a question.
Yeah, well, that really is the $64,000 question. If I may, I'd like to pick up on some of the excellent and very interesting points made by my colleagues on the panel and just briefly reference a couple of things. I personally think that in the future, when historians are writing the history of the era that we're currently living through, I think they're going to look back at the assumptions that the United States and much of the West made about the impact of integrating China into the global economy through the entry into the WTO in 2001. I think they're going to look back at that as a colossal strategic miscalculation of historical implications, because it's mind-boggling to think about how incredibly wrong we all were. And I include myself, and the smartest people were in the world. If you go back and you read some of the speeches that US President Bill Clinton made in the run-up to China's entry into the WTO in 2001, it was going to be a one-way street of benefit. China was inevitably going to evolve into a purely capitalistic economic system. The role of the state in the economy was going to recede. And although we kind of tiptoed around the issue, the expectation was that the political system was going to loosen up considerably, and we might not end up with a Jeffersonian democracy, but that there'd be a significant political evolution. Fast forward 25 years, and those speeches, and Clinton was not alone, and those speeches are cringeworthy for how incorrect they are. The role of the Chinese state in the economy has only tightened its grip, and the wealth and prosperity and economic development and technological sophistication that entry into the global trading system provided for China has only solidified and more deeply entrenched China's authoritarian system. So hindsight is always 2020. Nobody foresaw that this was the way the world was going to play out in the year 2000. But there was really almost all of our assumptions about the impact of integrating China have turned out to be wrong. And I think it'll be seen as a strategic miscalculation of historical implications. In terms of values, this is a real tricky one. And as I said, as a former trade negotiator myself, we could never imagine that trade relationships and trade negotiations have to deal with all of these value judgments. And it makes things immensely difficult. And I'll give you one example, and I'll give you the example of an American who spent the last 25 years living in Asia and the Middle East. And that is, there are a whole host of values that Americans and Europeans very proudly feel are universal values. And then if you spend a lot of time in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and other parts of the country, you learn that, well, these really aren't universal values. These are Western values, these are American and European values, and they don't really mesh with the conventions of other countries and other parts of the world. So I don't have any easy answers as to how this will be handled, but I think it's going to immensely complicate the negotiation of trade agreements, and it's also going to complicate our trading relationships on a commercial level, where consumers now have access to the supply chain information that the company where they buy their favorite pair of running shoes, what their supply chain looks like. So I think it's going to be a massive challenge for government trade negotiators and for corporate executives as well to figure out how you pick your way through this minefield. And I don't think there are any easy answers.
Yeah, please.
Quick comment to Stephen. You talked about miscalculations. I totally agree. So my question to you, Stephen, are we repeating the same mistakes with China as of today?
Here's what I would say. At a minimum, and here I'll talk primarily about the United States, I don't think it is quite the same case to the same extent in Europe. But at least in the United States, there is an across-the-board recognition that we got China wrong and that we need a fundamentally different approach. Inside Washington, D.C., there is literally, and I mean this very literally, only one issue that liberals and conservatives agree on, that Republicans and Democrats agree on, and that is the need to redefine the nature of the trading relationship with China. Absolute unanimity on that point. There aren't going to be any fights between the Biden administration and Congress in taking steps there. The question then becomes, okay, so what are the correct mistakes? How do you forge a new and different type of trading relationship with China while avoiding shooting yourself in the foot?
Exactly.
And I think that's the real question. Now, you all of you have your fingers much closer to the pulse on what's going on in European capitals. But at least in the United States, the only thing that liberals and conservatives agree on is that we got it wrong on China, and we've got to redefine and approach that relationship in a very different way moving forward.
But I use a chance and ask also from Lauri about that. Values and laws and institutions, how these values are really now, the competing values are translated into the regulations. I understand not the lecture, but but you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, they have obviously always been connected, values and the norms or the solutions that are chosen in law, and you know, often behind, let's say, certain norms, there are simply, well, values, but also interests, right? Think about in the international trade regime, how we say that when things are produced in industry, then it would be good to lower their tariffs, but we don't. We say that agriculture is a different regime. So many non-Western countries have thought this is a solution that, you know, works well for the West. But I want to go back to the initial presentation of Stephen, right?
Yeah.
And one point you said very interestingly was that if now, today and in the future, we would say to China that, look, no more trade in that. This all needs to be reasoned very well. And let me see how, my feeling is that many countries, especially in what previously used to be called the third world, would see it in very realist terms that China hasn't done so much anything wrong, but the number one of the world system got jealous over the rise of number two. So it's pure realism. And then they say that it's about somebody not being democratic and authoritarianism, but in no system does number one will be happy about the rise of number two. Think of, England's jealousy over the rise of Germany in the early 20th century, and then all ideological differences would be exaggerated. The enemy, the opponent would be somehow depicted as very problematic. Like what is the, so my question, rephrasing your point, is that how do we, in this new approach, what is the message to China? What has China done wrong in all of that? Except that its economic structure is quite different, and it subsidizes, it has state enterprises, and basically its economy functions differently.
Well, look, I think your point is absolutely right on target. I think, and sitting in Southeast Asia, a lot of the countries here have exactly that type of perspective. Is this just the Thucydides trap, where the prevailing power always tries to keep down the up and coming rising power, and isn't that just what we're seeing playing out here? And I think there are a lot of countries with a certain amount of good reason that's their interpretation of the situation. What concerns me, and the dangerous and destabilizing world that we might be heading for, is that countries might increasingly be forced to, quote unquote, pick a side. Particularly within Southeast Asia and ASEAN, the countries out here have mastered benefiting from relationships with both countries, avoiding tilting too decisively towards China, tilting too decisively towards the United States, and kind of playing both countries off against each other for their own maximum benefit, which is what any one of us would do if we were in their situation. I think it's potentially destabilizing now if the pressure is going to increase on these countries to quote unquote pick a side. So I think that's an important issue for us to keep an eye on. One comment I would make, though, to respond very specifically to this point. Well, what is it actually that China did? What did China do wrong? Well, look. The rules-based global trading system, and in particular the World Trade Organization, was clearly predicated on the assumption that the large trading nations in the world were going to be market-driven economies, and that business and commercial outcomes would be determined by market forces and not government fiat. And if you go back to the Marrakesh Declaration, which established the WTO, this is all very clearly spelled out. This is how we believe the game must be played. This is how we believe the game will be played. So if you say, well, what did China do wrong? I'd say, well, they contravened the fundamental premise upon which the whole trade rule book was established, which is commercial outcomes are dictated by market forces, not by government fiat. And for those of us who know China well, the preponderant impact of the Chinese government in the business environment, in determining economic outcomes, in some ways that are completely obvious, and in other ways that are completely camouflaged, is overwhelming. So in a sense, they've really now become either the largest or the second largest economy in the world, the most sophisticated or second most sophisticated technological country in the world, by contravening the foundational precepts upon which our existing trade system is predicated. So now you've got an environment which you've got two teams on the same playing pitch playing fundamentally different games, and we don't know how to referee that game. So I think there is a little bit of a problem with China. China's system has created a bit of a problem for us in the global trading system, in my estimation.
Thank you, Stephen. And I am thinking that we should honor also next sessions. And it is now really time to conclude here. But we have another session, fourth session, about new economic world order, when some questions will be discussed, future issues of European Union in that game, and cybersecurity and issues. So I invite people to come back also to session 4, 1555. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Krister and Lauri. And our event is going on, so please, floor is wet.